Hi, this is Ian. I'm here to talk about bread baking, and over the years, my bread baking recipe and method has evolved, and the current one I've been using for the last several years is a method by Ken Forkish. He's a baker based in Portland. He has a couple of really great stores here, and he has a wonderful book called Flour, Water, Salt, Yeast. So I highly recommend checking that out to see what else he does with his method, which is really wonderful method, very easy to understand, and produces great results. I also wrote a blog post a few years back on my website about this method, so I'll put that link in the description of this video. The first thing I do is to weigh out 1,000 grams of flour. This will make 2 loaves of bread. In this case, for this video, I ended up making 1 loaf of bread and some pizza dough. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But it's great to have a digital scale. This container I'm using is on the large side because I use it for other purposes. Next, I'm measuring out the water. This is going to be 760 grams of water. You can adjust the water based on your preferences and what you're using the dough for, but that's something typical between 750 and 780 grams. The water should be pretty warm, between 90 and 95 degrees, and it just helps get the yeast going. So here I'm mixing the water and flour together, and just until it comes together. We'll let it sit 20 to 30 minutes to let it autolyse. So this step is optional, but if you have the time to let it sit before adding the salt and yeast, I think it helps the dough come together a little bit better, and it's a small extra step that can make a difference. So if you have time to do it, otherwise, don't worry about it. So here I have 21 grams of salt and about 1 gram of instant yeast. It's about 1/4 teaspoon. And after letting this dough sit for 25 minutes, I'm adding the yeast on top of the dough as well as the salt. And we will combine everything together. Here I'm using a method called the pincer method, and the idea is to try to incorporate those 2 new dry ingredients into this dough. And I will do this a few times. It only takes a few minutes just to incorporate it. And I do this until I can't feel the grains of the salt and yeast anymore. And it's helpful to re-wet your hand each time you do this so that the dough doesn't stick too much to your hands. After letting it sit at least 10 minutes, you could do this anytime, we do a couple of folds. So this is the first fold where you're helping the gluten formation. And here's the second fold. You could get away without doing these folds, but you'll notice that the bread has more structure and will rise more in the oven when you bake it. After 12 to 16 hours of fermentation, so the next morning, it's time to shape the loaf and let it proof before we bake. So here I have a proofing basket. This is something that is nice to have if you do a lot of bread baking, but if you do not have one, it's easy enough to take a piece of cloth, flour it, and then put it in a bowl, or you can put it in a colander that has a little bit of breathability, and then just cover it up. So that's totally fine as well. This dough is 76% hydration, which is on the high side, so it's very nice to have a scraper like this to scrape it out. The scraper also helps you keep the dough off the board as well as cut the dough. Here I'm creating some surface tension, trying to get the dough tight so that it will rise correctly in the oven. And I will typically let that proof for 1 to 3 hours, depending on my schedule and the room temperature and how the dough is acting that day. Sometimes I will bake 2 loaves at the same time. Sometimes I will keep back the second dough in the fridge and bake it later in the week. In this case, today I decided to bake pizza that night. So I'm dividing the half of the entire dough into 3, and it turned out to be 290 grams each for the pizza dough, which is just about right for my pizza stone. You could eyeball these and make approximately sized pizza dough balls, but since I have the scale right here, might as well get it so that they're all exactly the same, and then that means the pizza will all be exactly the same size. Making pizza dough balls is pretty much the same step as making the bread loaf, shaping the loaf of the larger bread. Creating some surface tension and making it nice and round. So the first pizza I made was a natto, kimchi, black olive, and a cheddar. That was delicious. And then I made a couple other ones with various other ingredients. You can see that the dough was perfect and it turned out really, really great in these photos. One tip that I found very helpful is to, when you have your container full of dough, using dry flour to scrape it off works really, really well. So just take a little bit of flour, put it in there, and then use your scraper or your hand to take off that wet dough, because it will all clump up and it will all come out nicely. That way you don't have to try to struggle with it by cleaning it in water in your sink or letting it go down your drain. I've heated my cast iron Dutch oven pot at 500 degrees in the oven for 25 minutes, and the dough has proofed for about 2 hours, and it's ready to go in. Being very careful with this hot pot. Baking it in this cast iron Dutch oven is one of the keys to making an incredibly nice crust. 25 minutes in, we remove the lid and let the top brown. And then after 45 total minutes of baking, the loaf looks beautiful. Wonderful reddish brownish color, excellent oven spring, and as the bread cools, there is a very pleasant crackling sound as the moisture escapes, and it smells great. We do need to let it sit and let it cool at least a couple of hours before cutting into it. Excellent crumb structure. The crust is very crusty and crackly. It looks so good, smells so good. I had to give it a taste right there. And it was delicious, of course. So this is a no-knead bread method. And the two main things we need to know about this one is that it's overnight fermentation. So instead of kneading and making it go fast, we use very little yeast and do very little handling. So first we did the pincer method, and then we folded it a couple times and then just let it ferment overnight. Usually I will start this around dinner time, and then next morning after breakfast, I will form it into a loaf and then bake it off in the late morning is my typical schedule for this. Because it's a long fermentation and so little yeast, it's actually more flexible than using a lot of yeast and doing a shorter fermentation. The flavor is better, I believe, because there's less yeast involved and there's more flavor from a more complex flavor from the fermentation and the flour and the yeast and salt. The second important part is baking the bread in a cast iron Dutch oven, which first traps the steam in to create this really thick, crackly crust. And then when we take the lid off halfway through, then it allows it to brown. And the long fermentation and baking in the cast iron pot, these are the two things that make this bread very, very good. And the other thing that is very useful is using a scale and using a percentage. So of course, here I'm making 2 loaves of bread as directed by Ken Forkish's book. But of course, it's very easy to half that recipe. Or if you want to make 3 loaves, or you want to make a different size loaf, we just go with a percentage. So you take the flour first, and then off that number, we calculate 76%. In this case, we used 76% hydration. So you would calculate the amount of water to that percentage. And then the same thing, it was 2.1% salt. And then the yeast is going to be more or less a little bit. So that could be not, you don't have to make it exact to the 0.1 gram. You could do that if you had a sensitive enough scale, but you could sort of eyeball that one. So hopefully this video is enticing you to give this a try if you have not already yet. I think this recipe and method is fantastic, and I've been using it for a number of years. And when I give people this bread, they're always raving about it. So I think give it a shot, and if you have questions about it, of course, you can send me an email, contact me. You can also check out my blog post about this method. So good luck with it, and I'll see you next time.